Welcome everyone to today's collaborative mentoring webinar series. My name is Minnie Chen from Mentor National, and today's topic is going to be family engagement, a key to quality mentoring and social justice. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's get started. So before we get started, I just wanted to share some housekeeping information with you all. 1 week after the webinar, all attendees will receive an email with instructions to how to access the PDF of the presentation slides, as well as a link to the recording where the recording will be posted in addition to all resources. So please also take the time to complete the survey that will be at the end of the webinar. We appreciate your feedback. So we want to make this as a participatory experience as possible, but all attendees are muted for the best sound quality, but please feel free to engage with us and the panelists. You can type in your questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, in addition to chatting with us at the bottom of the screen as well. And you'll see that in the CC button, you can turn on subtitles for this webinar. In addition, we have a live captioner at the link here. Before we get started, we can get an idea of who's in the audience today. So we have 2 poll questions. Our first poll question is, what is your experience level in the mentoring field? You can take a couple seconds to answer that. You beginner, experienced, or an expert? Okay, so I'll give you all a couple more seconds. And so it looks like we have 40% of you all today are beginners, so 1 to 3 years of experience. 32% are experienced, and then we have 21% of you all are experts, so more than 10 years of experience with mentoring. So now I'm going to load the second poll we have today. So what is your role in the mentoring field? So are you mentoring practitioner or staff? Are you mentor, TA provider, funder, educator, or youth or mentee, or other? And feel free, if you're other, to introduce yourselves in the chat, say hi. And definitely, if you're several of these roles, we welcome you all as well. I'm going to close the poll up. So it looks like the majority of our audience here today are 78% practitioners. And then we have some mentors, a few educators, TA providers, and 4% other as well. So just welcome everyone today, and we hope the information we share will be applicable to you all. So now I want to introduce our facilitator for today's webinar. Dusty Ann North is the research director and TA provider with the California Mentoring Partnership. Dusty Ann has been a trainer and technical assistance provider for the youth mentoring field since 1995. She has a focus on youth, families, and transition-aged youth in high distress, such as child welfare, homeless, runaway, as well as youth involved in the justice system. She has an emancipatory abolitionist practice approach, bridges research and practice towards quality and evidence-based services, and is a lecturer and researcher at the UC Berkeley School of Social Welfare. So I'm going to pass it off to Dusty Ann to kind of kick us off with today's conversation.
Good morning to the West Coast, good afternoon to the East Coast, and somewhere in between. Can everybody hear me okay? Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have a really compelling topic and panel. So our focus today is to explore the importance of caregiver engagement in mentoring programs, as well as some of the factors that have prevented this from being done in meaningful ways in a lot of programs. And we're wanting to focus on this on a couple of levels. One is how important it is for actual match quality and for outcomes for individual youth and families. But we've also been having some really amazing conversations about, about the relationship between caregiver engagement and race and class equity for families, both inside mentoring programs and also when we are advocating for for and with youth and families in other systems. So we're going to kind of look at it in all of these domains and areas and try to highlight some really key connections between those. So that's kind of our main focus today. Next slide, please. So our learning objectives or our goals for today, we're going to actually start with considering a little bit about the history of mentoring in relation to communities of color and how this has impacted the ways in which we treat caregivers of the youth that we serve. We're going to learn about the latest research findings on caregiver engagement. And we're going to explore some themes of implicit bias, white saviorism, a deficit mindset that often characterize our approach to working class families and families of color, and suggest some ways forward to address these concerns. So that's kind of our goals for today. Next slide. So I'm very excited to introduce our two panelists for today. We've been having such a lively and incredible conversation behind the scenes about this that we're really excited to share with all of you. So first I have Henry Roberts, goes by Hank most of the time. And he has his bachelor's degree in psychology, first generation for his family. He came out of an award-winning career at 3M in pharmaceuticals to move into youth service. He's earned several awards and recognitions for his work with young people. He's also a member of several Black empowerment and racial justice organizations. And he is the California State Ed Committee. He's on the California State Ed Committee for the NAACP, as well as being the vice chair of the Richmond branch. And he's been a leader in a work group that we've had going on here in California under the auspices of the California Mentoring Partnership, where we've really been looking at racial justice and what it means in mentoring and how mentoring can be a tool for racial justice. And Hank has been a real thought leader there. So we're just really excited to bring him to the national stage and share some of what we've been learning from him in California. So welcome, Hank. And my other panelist today is probably familiar to some of you. This is Renée Spencer, who is a very prominent researcher in the mentoring field. She mostly does qualitative analysis. She has more than 70 publications. She's a social worker and a developmental psychologist. She's interviewed hundreds of mentors, youth, parents, caregivers, and mentoring program staff across several studies. She focuses on processes at work in the youth mentoring relationships with an emphasis on improving the quality of relationships. And she's a contributor to a number of mentors initiatives. And many of you know that she has presented before on these webinars and in other mentoring spaces about caregiver engagement. So we're excited to have Renée back with some new findings and some new takes on this topic. So welcome to both of my panelists. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. And we'll be handing off to each of you soon. But I wanted to give a little bit of context first. And this is my perspective, although we've talked about this amongst ourselves a little bit. I've been around the mentoring field for over 25 years, and I don't know if I would say always like from the turn of the 19th century, which Hank is going to talk a little bit about, but in the time that I've been part of the mentoring field, we've always been strong in emphasizing relationships, of course, leadership skills, taking a non-prescriptive approach, self-determination of young people, cultural sensitivity, some of these really important aspects of service that not all service fields are as strong in. So I think that's a real strength for our field. And there's been kind of a growing recognition that we need to deepen this aspect of the work. There's new recent attention to social justice. There's the development of a critical mentoring approach vis-a-vis Tori Westminster-Van and others, more of a focus of youth voice and leadership in programs, a little bit more attention to what anti-racism might look like in our field. So there's a growing recognition that we need to deepen our commitment to emancipatory work and respectful work and collaborative work. That said, the mentoring field has traditionally not engaged parents and other caregivers. There's, of course, exceptions. And there's been some recent attention to this. Like I said, this is not the first webinar that Renée has been on talking about these issues. But our perception is that this focus remains still pretty limited in a lot of programs, that this is not an area that most programs are feeling like they are doing as well as they could. So we always want to kind of bring this back and bring it back to the forefront and get people sort of thinking about it some more. And then meanwhile, like I mentioned, so back last April in California, the California Mentoring Partnership started hosting webinars every month, sometimes a couple times a month, to help programs pivot in the COVID situation and deal with some of the crises going on. And following the murder of George Floyd, we turned a lot of attention to racial equity and racial justice in a new and deepening way. And Hank, who you're going to hear from today, and some others, raised the point that a lack of parent engagement and caregiver engagement is really part of this racial equity and racial justice issue, and that there's some key ties there that we really need to understand and bring forward. So, so that's some of the context of what brought this discussion to light. And in California, we've created a sort of blueprint in progress for what racial justice in mentoring can look like, and better caregiver engagement is one of our key pieces, and we'll give you a link to that at the end. So that just gives you some background on how and why we're here talking today. Next slide, please. One last sort of thing I want to cover before we turn it over to our presenters. When we raise this discussion, we would, of course, want to be as inclusive and as thoughtful as possible about who are the caregivers and what do we mean when we say caregiver engagement. We always want to recognize that every family is different. We have a lot of systems-involved families. We have a lot of non-traditional families. So we don't ever want to make any assumptions about who caregivers are, or be making judgment calls about whether one kind of caregiver is more important than another, et cetera. So there are non-parental caregivers, of course, and they matter. There are also parents or biological parents that are not in caregiving roles, and they also matter. And we really want to give recognition to the idea that that systems involvement can really change the structure of families. There are, of course, separations, and even when there's not separations, it can really change what's going on in the family. And that's actually really key to today's discussion. So we didn't want to give the impression that this is just about kids who are being raised by their own parents, biological parents, that is, or that this topic isn't relevant for systems-involved families, because it very much is, and hopefully that will become apparent. So I just wanted to put that out there. So with that, I want to turn it over to Henry Roberts, to Hank, who's going to talk a little bit about the history of mentoring and what the experience of mentoring has been in the Black community and in communities of color in general. So welcome, Hank. Thank you so much for being here, and take us through some history.
Yes, it's such a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to speak about the transformation of 21st century mentoring from the perspective of a need for change. But I find that it's unequivocally necessary to really talk about history. Why history? And when we talk about history, I want to be real clear that this is not about blaming anyone. It's really about being able to be transparent, being able to be honest, and also putting us in a position where we can understand why change is necessary. I look at history as being like a map, and a map helps us understand how to get to one point to the other. But in life, our life map also helps us understand why change, or why not change, or should things remain the same. And it's an old saying that to do what you've never done, you got to really know where you're starting from. And then, and last but not least, history can clearly help us understand and undeniably, unequivocally, unavoidably know the truth. And sometimes the truth can be very, very painful. But in order to really move forward, we have to understand the legacies of the past that's permeating into our present. And that's why we need to have a clear understanding of the history of mentoring in order to understand what needs to change. So I think to even begin to talk about history, we really want to understand what is mentoring, and traditionally, just a real simple way of looking at it, mentoring tends to be an older person with some experience, who's parting that information and that skill set to a younger person who's eager to learn that skill or gain that wisdom to reach the goals that they are pursuing in life. So that's a very generic definition of mentoring. So what is mentoring is history. And I believe we'll all agree that ever since humans have walked on this earth, there's been a mentor. If you go all the way back to Africa, when young boys were learning how to hunt and were in the jungles, understanding how to make fire, that's a form of mentoring. When Socrates mentored Plato, that's mentoring. And so we could go on and on in terms of examples of mentoring, but I just want to pause for a minute and turn to the American history around mentoring, and specifically around the history in mentoring in relationship to Black and white America, because this is critical as we move to understanding what's happening today. So if we can recall, in 1619, the first slave ship actually landed here in America. So you said, Hank, what does it got to do with it? But it's clearly, we have to understand that for African Americans, it was critical that the adult parents mentored their children to understand how to work in the field, to be a really top-notch cotton picker. That was really important. It was important for the slave master to teach his children mentoring, how to have a very prosperous plantation. And also on both sides, to each teach the other in terms of, for example, the adult slave, how to teach that child to know how to interact with the slave masters. That's mentoring. So we have to be realistic about that initial beginnings to set the stage for where we're going near the end. So then slavery ended in 1863. So sharecroppers became the next stage. And of course, you're still saying, Hank, what's this got to do with it? But stay with me and we'll see. And of course, the Jim Crow laws kicked in 1877. And we know what Jim Crow laws were: just strictly segregation, no interaction in every form of life. There was no possibilities of Blacks and whites being able to even drink from the same fountain. So let's really keep that in context as we continue to go forward. But something very interesting happened in the 1900s. It was a very exciting, a very intriguing time, but it was also somewhat of a representation of 2021. So Hank, what do you mean? What was happening? Well, of course, remember the Jim Crow laws, but because of that, Black Wall Street, which was a very prosperous community of Black folk who really learned how to work together, who mentored each other. They had different businesses, banks, clothing stores, barbershops, you name it. It was a full spectrum of services. And there was mentoring that was occurring during this Black Wall Street. But then also, as we talked about the sharecropping, something interesting happened. Equipment became much more efficient for picking cotton. And so all of a sudden there was this great migration. And in this great migration, Blacks left the South because they were looking for opportunities to go into the factories in the North and the East and the West. But yet in the midst of that journey going forward to those new regions, the Klan was very excited in a negative way because they saw jobs being taken because of Blacks coming to really work and actually work for cheaper labor. So that was that major clash. Now remember, this is still the Jim Crow era. But ironically, in 1904, and I want to turn my hats off to this organization, the Big Brothers and Big Sisters actually started. And in that same time frame, shortly after, the NAACP started. So let me be clear, when NAACP started, colored mean Black people of different shades, light, mulattoes. So that it was strictly about Blacks. And I'll put that into context later. And I'm almost there, but I think if you stay with me, you'll see why this is important. So then, ironically, it wasn't until 1964 that the Civil Rights Act kicked in to really outlaw this whole Jim Crow issue. Think about that, 1964. So for all these years, there was that segregation that was a part of America, that divide. And think about this too, in the midst of that I shared with you, there was a lot of unrest and there was clashing and misunderstandings as we look at where we are today. And I'm almost there. So when you talk about the 60s, once now the Jim Crow laws were eliminated, then we had something called suburban flight or suburban integration. Now Blacks were allowed to go to the suburban areas. And so now the neighborhoods that Blacks lived in were low income, lower class. And so the neighborhoods really became a major shift. Now, traditionally, mentoring in Black neighborhoods was often done very spontaneously. It was not necessarily organized. It wasn't, purposely designed. I recall one of the greatest mentors in my life was a wino who I just completely ignored. And one day he said to me in a very professional way, "Hank, I really want to talk to you." And I didn't know what he had to say. And he told me he was a college graduate and he'd gone through so many changes in life. And he left me with this one thought. He said, "Hank, always remember to let no one stop you to do what your dream is, because you're the real dreamer and that's you." And I could go on and on about who this guy was, but again, it was a spontaneous mentoring experience. Often we had aunts and uncles and cousins and nephews and coaches, which is common for all of us, but very specifically for us, because again, there was that segregation issue. But most importantly, there was a relationship with the family. The mothers and fathers knew who was mentoring their children. So those relationships were very solid and inclusive around a partnership. And then something else interesting happened when that suburban flight took place. Stay with me, I'm almost there. The crime rate in the Black neighborhoods began to skyrocket. Youth of color, and now I'm referring to not just African Americans, but youth of color, meaning Latino Hispanics as well. All of a sudden, there was a need to address youth crime. So the Department of Justice and then of course the Brothers Keepers, which was started with Obama, began to flood money to get organizations to address these challenges of these kids of color. But I want you to think about this as I get almost there. The majority of the mentors were white, and the majority of the mentees were of color. Look back at history and follow me and see why there is definitely some concern. So as I really wrap this up, so what is the impact of all this, Hank? What do you mean? And now we look at COVID-19 as it unravels and we see all the challenges that we're facing. And so the question now is, are programs and mentors attuned to the needs and the values of youth and of the caregivers? Or are the mentors and practitioners now in a position where they can really understand how to approach the youth and families from this deficit mindset? And then almost there is the working class caregivers and caregivers of color, are they not seen with value and respect as a result of this history? And then lastly, are we really looking at the role of caregivers in having a voice that could influence the systems that are serving their children? So to understand the history, and I'm done now, we have to take that journey that I took you on to set the stage for understanding why transformation is more important now than a reformation and moving forward in mentoring. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Hank. Really helpful. Thank you so much. So Hank has kind of brought us through the 20th century into the 21st century and sort of where we are today. And now we can actually turn to very current research findings to see how that legacy of segregation and of sort of maybe well-meaning but not necessarily attuned history brings us into what mentoring programs look like today in terms of caregiver engagement. So I know we'd love to say, oh, we transcended all of that and now we have a great relationship with our families of color, but tell us how it really is, Renee.
Thank you, Destiane, and thank you so much, Hank, for that context. I think it's just critical to have that historical context and really frames up kind of where we live today, very important ways to help us understand what the way through and forward might be. And it's been such a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to get to know Hank through this process and to work with Hank and Destiane and Minnie on this webinar. So it's just a thrill for me to get to be here today and to share a little bit about some of the research that we've done with caregivers and how we can think about that in the context that Hank so eloquently laid out for us about what this means and how that context might be shaping our practices and how we can begin to shake that legacy and build a new future that has a much more collaborative feel to it, and one that really does well serve our mentors, mentees, families, everybody in this process. So let me start out just by talking a little bit about how we tend to talk about mentoring, which is as if it's this dyad, this mentor youth dyad. I know this is how I started out when I was first thinking about mentoring and first started doing research on mentoring. I was really thinking about that mentor youth dyad and the quality of that relationship, and that's super important. And we still have lots to learn about that, but there's a whole lot more besides that dyad. And really important player are the parents or caregivers, the people who are centrally involved in that young person's life, who are the ones who hold the primary responsibility for shepherding that child through childhood and into adulthood, and to whom others may join in that process. But that parent or caregiver really sits at the center of that. And I think in mentoring, we've lost sight of that. And there's a lot of reasons for it. So first, let me say, when I first started looking at parents and caregivers and was joined with a then doctoral student at that time of mine, Antoinette Basualdo de Monaco, we were looking at the literature and found that parents just tend not to even be there. They tend to be invisible from the research literature at any rate. When they are talked about, we found they tended to be tapped to talk about reporting on their child, so to be a reporter of the kid, but not really asked about their own experiences with mentoring or what they were looking for from mentoring programs or what they wanted to get out of it or what they thought, how they thought it might be helpful to their child. And so we didn't really have that voice from parents and caregivers. And so we didn't really have a sense of what they were looking for from mentoring. So their own experiences were really absent, and that is a critical omission. And unfortunately, when parents did get talked about, there was often a negativity of how they could sabotage the relationship or get in the way of that mentoring process or create trouble, and that programs and mentors kind of need to be on the lookout for that trouble. So, where does that come from? It's this sense of, and let me just say that, at the same time, we know that parent involvement really matters in all sorts of ways for children. It's sort of obvious as soon as you say it. And we know a lot about that in education. It's really been well documented, the importance of parents in education and in mental health now settings as well. So we're hoping mentoring can stand on those shoulders and really benefit from that and pay attention as well. So let's go to the next slide and talk some about how parents get viewed, these different views. And all too often, unfortunately, it's this deficit model of how parents can be a problem. Unfortunately, we hear things like the parents aren't doing their job well enough, and that's why a young person needs a mentor. I mean, talk about a deficit perspective, that's really at its core. Sort of somehow this mentor is going to replace and do better than the parent. A really profound kind of problem focus kind of at its core of the roots of mentoring. If we think about the history that Hank gave us, where might that be coming from? And this is where racism has a role to play here of who are the families who are being served and who are the mentors who are serving, and this notion that the white mentor knows best and the white program staff person maybe somehow knows best in all of this. And instead, what we want to really advocate is more of this kind of strength-based approach, and programs are doing this. There are some programs that are taking this, really focusing on the assets of individuals, what they bring, what everyone brings to the table, and how can we leverage that and build capacity. The other place of a legacy of this view of parenting caregivers comes from what we have in our social policy in the United States is we tend to think of low-income families as either being deserving or undeserving of help. So the deserving poor being people who couldn't help it, they got knocked off their feet briefly, they just need a little boost to get back on. And then there's this other underclass who are just kind of chronically poor. They're always going to be a problem. It's just never going to get right. And so we don't want to funnel too many resources there. And our whole welfare policy system is built around this kind of structure. And mentoring reflects that, because we tend to think of the youth as the deserving poor person, the person who no fault of their own is in this set of circumstances, and we can get in there and really help with that. But those parents and caregivers, you know, they're just riddled with problems, and that's kind of what's created this situation in the first place. It's that kind of a really negative bias that's infused in mentoring. So next slide, please. Where does some of that bias come from? You know, I don't think we're all waking up in the morning and going, how can we think negative things about low-income families or families of color? There is this bias that is, because we have these classism, racism, other forms of sexism, ableism, all these things sort of baked into our systems, unfortunately, it shapes how we think about and interact with one another. And there's now tons of research on this idea called implicit bias, which are attitudes that we carry towards people, groups of people, and stereotypes that we associate with that. So I put some in the bubbles there. You know, I've done a lot of research on adolescent sexuality in my graduate school days. I worked with a sexuality researcher. So a classic one we worked with there was adolescent boys only want one thing, right? That's a stereotype about adolescent boys. Boys were aware of that stereotype and responded to that. Or this notion that poor people are lazy, they just don't work hard enough. And that's sort of what created that. So it's not that we're always thinking these things consciously, but because they're baked into our systems, those things can get evoked when we're in a situation that taps our assessment, which human beings are really quick to assess, synthesize, and make a judgment about something. And all too often we have this well of negativity to draw from when we're thinking about low-income families and families of color. And so we carry these stereotypes with us, and they can be unconscious and unintentional and involuntary. And there's really excellent research that shows this. There's a great book called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele, who is a researcher of another form. Some people call implicit bias. There's also stereotype threat. There's another whole line of research kind of looking at this. And he titled his book after New York Times columnist Brent Staples, who wrote an essay about walking down the street as a Black man and knowing he's being perceived as a threat. People would move to the other side, white people would move to the other side of the street to not have to pass him. So he adopted this strategy of whistling things like Vivaldi's Four Seasons as he's walking down the street to disrupt that stereotype and sort of create a different context. And he found that people responded differently to him. I offer this example because receivers of this implicit bias and stereotype threat are all too aware that these kinds of judgments are being carried about them. And they're constantly having to adapt and move through the world in response to that. Women know this in the ways that we adjust our behaviors. Low-income people know this. People of color know this. It's those ways in which these implicit bias then get really infused in our interpersonal relationships. Okay, all that context, let me jump into programs and talk in the next slide about kind of how this influences parent engagement. One of the places we started, Tonya and I, we started out with this was just wanting to talk to programs about how do you engage parents. So Big Brother, Big Sister was really interested in this. We partnered with them. We did some focus groups, and you know, you can engage parents in all sorts of ways. What does that look like? And one interesting thing that we learned about this was that there were these different ideas about how programs thought about engaging parents. Many of them talked about this notion of involving parents, and this was really rooted in this parents can be roadblocks. So we need to kind of convey our clear expectations to them. They need to know how our program works. We need to instruct them in how to be good parents within the confines of our program. And we'll invite them to events that we schedule, and we're going to do our best to really try to involve them in our model as we've constructed it. Then we had other programs who would sort of say things like, well, you can't really work with a child unless you work with the whole family. If you have a child in need, you have a family in need. So we really want to think about that larger context, and we're not going to serve just the child, but we're also going to serve the family. So that was this engaging and serving agency. And then the smaller group were these agencies who talked about parents as collaborators and saw the strengths, assets, and opportunities in parents. They saw parents and caregivers as experts to be leveraged in the service of promoting the mentoring program. Interestingly, in some cases, these were the programs that were serving some of the highest need young people. So an example that really stands out to me is a mentoring program that was serving young people who had a parent who was incarcerated. And one of the things they learned is when that parent comes home after being incarcerated, if there's a mentor in the picture that parent didn't know about, sometimes those relationships would then break up at that point and be disrupted because the parent's like, who's this person in my kid's life? I don't know anything about this person. So they built a relationship with the area prison systems, and they would go in and meet with the parent who was incarcerated and talk with the parent about the prospective mentor, introduce this relationship and get that parent's input into the process, so that then when the parent gets released and comes back home, they already know who this mentor is, they had a say in the process. And that's that sense again of thinking really creatively about, how do I engage this entire system? And that's that collaboration process. Parents as collaborators, they're important players in this. So then we went on and did another study. My doctoral student actually did this study where she interviewed mentors, agency staff, and parents about their expectations for the parental role. I'm not going to go into detail with this. I can send these papers to anybody who'd like them later. But one of the reasons I'm showing you this slide is look at that last box. So mentors saw parents in these potential roles. They can support the outing, they can provide information, they can monitor the match, but they didn't really see or talk about the role in supporting the mentor-youth relationship or ensuring the quality of the relationship for the youth. And most agency people didn't identify that either, but parents sure did. Parents saw all of these roles as being roles for them. So I just highlight that we've really sidelined parents and haven't really thought about how much they have to contribute. But parents are sure aware of that. And when we've talked to them, they said, oh, I play this really important role in making sure this match goes well and really making sure that things run smoothly. We have one paper we wrote called Working to Make It Work. That was how parents described their own role in the background of really working to make that mentor-youth relationship work, but often in ways that were unseen by either the mentor or the program staff person. They were kind of invisible ways that they were working. All right, so then we embarked on another study of caregiver and parent engagement. Really, this study was about factors that contribute to early ending relationships, but no surprise, the important role of caregivers came out in this study. And I'm going to share just a little bit of teasers of some of those findings with you. But to say that we started with, rather than mentor-youth dyad model, just mentor and youth, we started with Tom Keller's more systemic model that takes into account the parent, family, caregiver situation, the agency program staff person as well, and how all of these relationships are interacting with one another to influence the quality of that mentor-youth dyad. I would say too, we could draw another bunch of big rings around this and talk about the social context that Hank walked us through, and thinking about the historical context that we're all swimming in, the legacy, the systemic racism that we're all swimming in and living with now, that you could draw those circles around, and all of this is embedded in that. And so you see this sort of come out in these case examples. So we interviewed for this study, we interviewed parents, we interviewed mentors, and we interviewed the program staff workers. We didn't interview the youth, that's a whole other story. I won't go into it, but there were reasons why we didn't. But we interviewed those three players in this model and really kind of looked at the relationship development over time, and did this analysis of pulling all the interviews together and building these really rich case studies. And I'm going to share little snippets of a few of them to just give you a sense of that, the role of caregivers, three different kinds of ways that caregivers, the importance of that relationship. So in the next slide, I have an example of, we then filled out these systemic models with information about each of the cases. All three of these examples are male matches by chance. I didn't mean to pick that, but I picked them for different reasons, and they just all happen to be male mentor-youth matches in these cases. But in what we did in these triangle models is sort of looked at which relationships were going well as reported by both participants in that particular dyad, and which seemed to be in trouble. And so this is an example of where all the other relationships seem to be going okay, but the mentor and parent were having a hard time in that relationship, and that ended up disrupting, ultimately contributing to this match ending early. And in this case, we had a mentor who they started meeting right before the summer. This is a young person who has a Native American background and actually spends the summer on an area Native American reservation, and so went away for the summer, and the mentor built up a bunch of other commitments while the young person was gone. When the young person came back, the mentor struggled to get that young person back in his life, and the parent really struggled with how much the mentor struggled. This was a young person who had some difficulties with adults abandoning him, and so it was super important to this caregiver that that mentor show up as promised and be very consistent. It wasn't happening, and this parent was not happy with the situation. And so this relationship broke down. What was really mattered to this particular parent, in this case, it was a grandmother who was the caregiver, you know, those needs, it wasn't being met. And this is what she really thought was really critical for her son. In the next slide, it's an example of what on our team we end up calling double teaming. And this is where, because when you have white middle-class mentors, they're often working with program staff people who share that background. They're often also white and middle class. And then you might have a family that you're serving that is low income and of color. And so there are ways in which the mentor and program staff can be aligned with each other and share a deficit view of the family. And this was a case of this, where we had, in this case, another grandparent taking care of a child being the primary caregiver. We had a mentor who was really wanted the relationship to go a particular way, got very frustrated with scheduling issues. And this was a family that, this was a grandmother who was taking care of multiple children that the parent wasn't able to take care of. And so there was lots of complicating factors. Her car broke down. She couldn't get the young person to a agreed upon match event that the mentor had invested both time and money in setting up. And the mentor got super frustrated and said, I just can't do this anymore. And in this case, the program staff person also sort of characterized this parent, again, a grandparent, taking care of multiple children as, you know, disorganized, not responsive, really not taking into account the context that this caregiver was living in and the complexities of her life and what it means to live her life and how much control she had and did not have over her circumstances, her transportation, a lot of factors. So here in this case, both the program staff and the mentor really viewed the parent negatively, unfortunately, and the parent was aware of it. This parent caregiver was aware of it. All right, the last example I'm going to leave you with is when there's a mentor who's just out of sync, a mentor and parent who are out of sync. And in this case, also out of sync with the program staff, where the program staff person and the parent were on the same page, and it was the mentor who really wasn't. And in this case, the parent had lost a child, and this young person had lost a sibling, a younger sibling, and the parent really thought that this young person needed respite, needed distraction, fun, something else to do. But this young person was struggling in school, and the mentor really thought the child needed to bring their grades up. And so the mentor would center the outings on studying and trying to bring the grades up. And the parent really wanted the outings to be centered on having fun and giving the child a break. And the two of them could not see eye to eye. The program staff person tried to get the mentor to let go of that other agenda and join the parent's agenda, and they were unsuccessful, and this relationship ended up breaking up as well. But here, again, an example of a parent and a mentor being really out of sync about what the young person needs. And in this case, the mentor really deciding, I know best. And since I can't, you know, continue to pursue my agenda in this relationship, I just can't be in this relationship. And so got out. Okay. I think that's, I'm going to leave you with that. Those are some little snippets from our research, and we're going to pass it back over to Destiane, I think.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Renee. Great to hear what the latest findings are. And I thought it was so interesting that the study Renee was just showing, it wasn't a study of caregiver engagement. It was a study of match quality, match longevity, and these themes of how caregivers engaged really emerged as really critical to whether the matches were doing well. So I thought that was really compelling to remind us to give this issue a lot more attention. So we're going to go ahead and turn back to Hank to do a little bit more. We've been talking so far about how caregiver engagement is important in matches and for match quality and match outcomes. But there's another aspect here, which is about when we're doing advocacy and when we're supporting youth and families in the other systems that that serve or don't serve them, et cetera. And Hank has a lot of experience with this, so he's going to take us through some thoughts about systemic and institutional racism and the promise of mentoring as a potential remedy for some of these issues if we engage parents and other caregivers appropriately. So take it away, Hank. Oh, we might have a connection problem for Hank. Let's see if that resolves. Hank, we've lost you. Hopefully that will reconnect. Oh. Okay, well, we'll give Hank a minute to try to get reconnected. Hank, just jump in if you get reconnected. And I guess it's appropriate. I can just talk about some of the things I know he wanted to say here, but we'll let him take over because he can say it a lot better than I can. But I know he wanted to talk about that systemic and institutional racism is the racism that's actually threaded into the systems. It's not just about the implicit bias or the deficit thinking in individual practitioners. It's about how the systems are built that way, and that this affects working class families and families of color in the criminal justice system, in the housing system, in healthcare and mental health, in child welfare and education systems. And Hank works a lot in the schools and is there really addressing what's considered achievement gaps between students of color and white students. And he's made some real headway in assisting parents and other caregivers to be listened to a lot more and engaged a lot more in their children's education. So he has a lot of insights into how that does. Aha, we hear you, Hank.
Yes,
there
I
you
can
are.
hear you.
Oh, good. I was
you
just
so much.
doing kind of a hack. I was just doing kind of a hack job at least explaining a little bit about systemic and institutional racism. So please take over. Go for it.
No, I really appreciate that, and I apologize for whatever that issue was. I had no real control over it. But I really wanted to just really say to all of us that, you probably could look back and say, "Oh, thanks, Hank, for that historical perspective. I'm glad that's over with." That's a long time ago, and we don't really have to go back into the past anymore because that is the past. Well, unfortunately, we are living in another era of slavery, and it's called systemic institutional racism. And I know you probably say, "Hey, Hank, I don't get that. Why would you call that slavery? It just doesn't really, it really doesn't make sense." And before I can really get into more detail, I have to introduce you to the cousins of systemic institutional racism. And one of them is called prejudice. And prejudice is basically a negative attitude or limited knowledge about a race. It's so limited, but you still have an attitude. For example, people say blacks are lazy, but when was the last time you knew someone that worked in the cotton fields from sun up to sundown, 6 days a week for no pay? I don't see that as being a lazy person. And again, I'm just giving you a perspective of why being prejudiced is really an issue. Then we talk about discrimination. It's a negative treatment just because of a person's race, color, or national origin. And then, of course, then we talk about racism, which is an intentional, purposely practice of taking advantage of another person because of their race. So we have to really understand all of these relatives of systemic institutional racism before we can really begin to understand what systemic institutional racism really is. So now, Hank, what are you getting at? So we look at categories of racism. One starts with individuals. And individual races is very obvious. We could go back to the 1963 bombing by the KKK. So there's this black church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 children were killed. That's very intentional, if you will, individual, but yet it was the group collectively of what you would call individual racism. And then we think about the one that's very covert. This is a sneaky one, the one that you don't even realize that it exists. And that's in the umbrella of institutional racism. And it's so covert because simply what happens is policies and procedures are designed to create discrimination and prejudice practices. It's just entwined into that fiber And then we come to this reality of what. So then, Hank, what is systemic institutional racism? You're talking about all these different categories. So what is ultimately, what is that? And this is the most devastating form of racism that exists, because systemic institutional racism is the value systems of America that's embedded into the fibers of our society. It's become our norm. And if you look back on the journey that we went on in understanding history in relationship to mentoring, and you come forward, you can see there's no way we can get around the fact that Jim Crow laws were definitely instrumental in becoming part of our fiber. Because when you look at everything I've said about systemic institutional racism, about individual racism, about institutional racism, if I were to summarize what is a differentiation, white privilege is the one key that avoids you from having to experience those experiences that are represented by systemic institutional racism. So I know you said, well, what does that mean, Hank? I mean, one of the values of systemic institutional racism in a positive perspective is that it creates generational wealth, but it also creates generational poverty, because there's nothing to pass on if you don't have anything to give back to your child. So it becomes a real challenge. So then you say, well, Hank, how is it? What do you mean? How is it affecting us today? I mean, what's going on? So we look at the criminal justice system, basically on a percentage wise, almost 40% of those that are incarcerated represent the African American community. Yeah, we only represent 13% of the population. This is 2021. I mean, why would we have to pass a housing act, to make sure that there's no injustice around buying a house or selling a house or renting a house, because everything is fair? But why would we have to pass a Fair Housing Act in 1964? And then we talk about healthcare, and Black infants have twice as likely chance of dying of mortality than whites. Why is that? Is there some equities around how hospitals are serving Blacks versus whites? That's a real good question. Then we talk about welfare. I mean, child welfare, foster care. Why is there such a disproportionate number of children of color, specifically African American, that are for some reason in that system? And again, this is all reality. This is where we're living today. So then let's tap dance into the one that's very significant. Well, what about the educational system? I mean, it's equal. Everybody has a chance to go to school. Everybody have a chance to get an education. So why is that really an issue? It's interesting because in 1926, Carter B. Wilson, who's known as the father of Black history, made every effort he could, because of his experiences of getting a PhD in European history. He did everything he could because of his feeling disconnected around his own history, because he had very little knowledge about who he was, yet he had a PhD in history. He did everything he could in 1926 to try and emerge an agreement with the schools to allow Black history to be a curriculum. Can you imagine how different America would be today if in 1926 that project that he was on could have became a reality? We probably wouldn't have some of the challenges we're having today because of the history that would be known about each other. And then when you look at the achievement gap in education, it's getting wider and wider and wider. African American children are still at the plethora of the bottom of that achievement gap. Why is that? And again, there's no blame. Remember, this whole conversation is about blame, but we also recognize that over 80% of the teachers in public schools are white. And again, let's go back to the analogy that at least 80% of the mentors are white, not all, but again, look at these percentages. These are the folks that are leading and guiding and giving direction to children of color. And then of course, our administrators traditionally have a tendency to be white. Our counselors, So again, it's not a fault, it's a reality, it's a transparency that we all have to live with. But here's what really touches my heart. When 18% of the Black children that are in preschool represent 40% of the suspensions in preschool, that should make anyone question what's going on in the educational system. And one of the most devastating challenges in the educational system is that our parents have no knowledge of how to navigate. They don't know their rights. They just really don't know. They don't know what a school site council is. They have no idea of the value of being involved in decision-making around how funding is being utilized and how to exercise their equity in choosing the programs that are better suited perhaps for their children. So there's no equity in power. So again, I'm just making it real clear that systemic institutional racism is very subtle, it's very embedded in our system, and we often don't pay attention to it if we're not aware of it. So now you say, Hank, I hear you. So how is this affecting our caregivers? Well, often, as we already know, caregivers of color they're not engaged. So they don't have any opportunities to address some of the things that I'm talking about. Many times we even blame them or alienate them, as has been alluded to by Renée. We often lack the power to find out what is it that is causing this child or this family to not get their needs met. And oftentimes, caregivers are just simply told to get involved. And we're going to find out sooner than later that getting involved is not enough. They have to get engaged. And we're going to talk about that again later. But these are some of the hidden behind the scene challenges that our children and families of color are facing. And in all actuality, with COVID-19, this is a ripe opportunity for us in mentoring to erase all that I have said that's problematic and begin to move forward to then look at this as an opportunity that we don't want to miss. I mean, in addition to creating the mentor matches and looking at mentoring programs and how we can best position ourselves and work with the child, how about there's this opportunity for us to meet the needs of the family? Because remember, in most situations where there's a need, people don't really want to know what you know. They really want to know if you care. And so with COVID-19, here's an opportunity for us to really look at what services are out there that we could talk to that family about. We also have an opportunity to really position ourselves for families to see us as more than just concerned about the child, but really concerned about the whole family. And then how do we then engage that process so that we can begin to help them understand how to navigate through this system? So mentoring in actuality is really an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to do several things. One is to keep families together, to reduce incarceration, and of course, to reduce the achievement gap. And I believe as we move forward, taking in this opportunity, we can be that model for America to really understand how we can make this change. And that change has to come through moving beyond reformation, thinking about what I'm saying, and move to transformation. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Hank. And thanks for rallying after the little gap. I know that throws things off, but you really highlighted some key points here. Minnie, can you go back to the last slide just for a second? So I think what Hank has been really highlighting for us is the potential, if we do engage families better, how we can not only help matches be better, but how we can help those families do better and those youth do better in the other systems that serve them by sort of partnering with parents and helping give and other caregivers and helping give them a voice. So what we wanted to do, and we're running a little bit behind time, so I want to be strategic here. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Minnie. we wanted to discuss some of these themes a little bit more. We wanted to talk about this issue of implicit bias a little more. We wanted to delve into what white saviorism kind of looks like, how it plays out in mentoring matches. And we wanted to get to some solutions and strategies, although we have some caveats about jumping right to a laundry list of pointers kind of thing. But given that it's 11 o'clock here in California, sorry, given that we have only about 15 minutes left and we do want to get to questions and answers, I think I would suggest we go to the white saviorism issue and question, because we have talked a little bit about implicit bias. Renee did have a really nice slide for us that has an exercise you can do. So when you get the slides later, Minnie, you could show the slide just for a second so people can see what it is. But there's a drawing that you look at and you challenge yourself to notice what you notice about it, and sort of what your implicit tendencies are to notice, and then sort of challenge yourself to look at it in another way. So you can do that on your own. And Hank had some, yeah, that's this drawing. And then Hank had some, if you go to the next slide, Hank had some points about how implicit bias plays out in matches. But these are some of the things that that mentoring program professionals and mentors might fall into. But let's jump to this question of white saviorism. Hank, can you talk a little bit more about what that is, what it looks like, and how it might play out in mentoring? Can you speak about that a little bit?
I think again, if we go back to the historical journey that we traveled on from the entry of the slave ship coming to America and that whole journey, it's this ideology that white saviorism means that I really know what you need. I really have the answer. You really need me because look at me, look what I've done. And I think some of this is embedded in the historical relationships that were once in slavery. And of course, if you look at what I just said about systemic institutional racism, it's very difficult to not look at that as still coexisting until you understand what the challenges that really are in front of us around systemic institutional racism. I think also I had mentioned this earlier, that when you come with this superior, I'm better than, not necessarily intentionally, but just kind of the way that we have talked about being programmed in deficit thinking, you're not building that kind of relationship that's going to create the outcomes as best that you could, especially in the 21st century. Then there's this condescending attitude, is just, again, that you really don't know. Look what I did. Look what I've accomplished. I mean, you say that with body language sometimes, and it's implied in the way that you communicate, again, because you're not talking about how much you care, but you're talking about what you know and what you've accomplished. And you have your master's degree, and don't you want this? And I don't know why you're not. So there's all these kind of thoughts. And then there's that perspective of dependency. You really need me. Look at what you're doing. You don't know. I mean, look at where you live. Look at it may not even come out, but it's subliminal sometimes, and it's embedded within your thinking. A subliminal messages sometimes that come out, but not necessarily spoken, but it's in your head. So I think this white saviorism falls into all of these categories, and it interferes with the mentoring that's necessary today. Because if you look at what's happening now in America, the last thing you want to do is to come in and have all the answers when people are hurting for having a collective understanding of what they're going through. And what better time for you to bring that collectivity of understanding than now? I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you. And I thought the last example that Renee showed of the matches, the one that she called out of sync, was kind of a good example, or not good, but a clear example, I guess is the right word, of white saviorism, where the mentor really felt that they knew what was best for the child, no matter how much the child disagreed, no matter how much the caregiver disagreed. This mentor was going to swing in there and save everybody with their superior knowledge, and that obviously didn't work for the match. And if and if mentors are seeing themselves as saviors, and I don't think this only just applies to white versus of color. I think there's class issues that can happen here, but anytime we're seeing ourselves, or the mentors are seeing themselves as somehow superior or more knowing, or seeing the family served as needing them and dependent on them, then we start to run into trouble. So thanks for that, Hank. We want to get to, I'm sure that people are feeling really hungry for some solutions, and what do we do about all this? This is really kind of an aha feeling for a lot of us of where things might be going wrong in our matches and where we might not be able to do as good a job supporting families and systems as we'd like to. And I'm going to skip forward a little bit here, but so Hank, I think I'll just say a few words about this part if this is okay, just to move us ahead. But when we planned this webinar, we thought, okay, well, let's make sure to give some strategies and solutions, because that's always something that's important to offer. But we were a little hesitant on this because this is such a deep topic, and really changing our own thinking, changing the way we approach things is probably the most important piece here. And yes, we can give some strategies, and we do have some tips today, but we were a little concerned about just throwing tips and tools at you, because we really think this requires a lot more depth. And we feel like this is a topic that's it's a conversation that's always sort of in the backdrop of what we're doing. And we really wanted to bring the why this is important and bringing new reflection to it forward. So, so we do have a few pointers and tips today, but we really feel like that would require a whole second webinar, or maybe even a lot of ongoing training for programs. This is going to take some deep work. This is not something we can just throw some tips at you and you'll have the answers. But we did bring a few today, so never fear if you're extra hungry for at least where to start. So just know that this is just a beginning of the conversation, and that the examples and the suggestions we're going to offer today are just scratching the surface. They're really not even going to get you there, but it at least is maybe a place to start. So we want to, if you go to the next slide, we want to suggest that you move in this direction that Renee pointed out, of not just involving, or not just, and we do think that family services can be a really great thing, not just serving the young person, but finding out what the family's needs are. And Hank's program has done some really wonderful work in addressing families' needs, not just the young people's needs, and other programs are doing that as well, especially during COVID. But really moving toward that idea of collaborating, of seeing the caregivers as experts, as active participants and contributors to the match, not just on the sidelines. So we want to give some thoughts about how you might do that. So Hank had some good tips about that. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, actually, sorry, Renee had some first. I apologize. So we'll do Renee and then Hank, and then I think we'll have time for a question or two at the very end. So go ahead, Renee.
Sure, thanks, Dusty. And just I think it's more principles than practices. It's sort of thinking about how you're going about, connecting with caregivers, and how you're thinking about how that fits in your program model. I think as a place to start is just really thinking about, are you in tune? Do you have a good understanding of what the parents and caregivers who come to your program, what they're expecting to get out of the experience, what they're hoping for their child, for signing them up for this program, what their needs are, and what the caregivers' expectations are about what their role might be. I think one of the things that we learned in some of this research is not everybody wants the same thing. It's not a one size fits all, that one caregiver might be super involved in some ways, and another caregiver may say, no, thank you. I mean, part of what I'm trying to do to sign up for this program is to get some help here. And, you guys, I trust you to do this. I can watch my child and look for signs and make sure everything's okay, and that's all good. So it's conversations, I think, with the caregivers about what the expectations are and how this program can work for them, and what ways that you are able to tailor how you do things to meet the needs of some individual caregivers and young people and mentors as you move through these relationships. I would say too, it's really important to take a hard look at policies and practices, and whether or not you're tapping family strengths, and you're really thinking about caregivers and families as assets, and what they're bringing to the table, and trying to root out this roadblock notion, or kind of the deficit approaches, and they can be really subtle and kind of creep in there. So kind of taking a hard look at the language that you use, policies that are in place, What happens if a parent doesn't do something in the way that you ask them to do it? What's the assumption about what that means? You know, can you think about this differently? And thinking about issues like I gave you that example of the program that had the really difficult problem to solve, which is, man, these parents come home after being incarcerated and they're surprised to see this adult. What do we do? That's a tough problem to solve, but they sat down and really thought it through and thought about, well, how can we solve this problem? And if it's that the parent feels on the outside, then how do we make sure that parent feels on the inside? And how could we go about trying to address that? So really thinking about how you're thinking about your policies and practices, how you think about caregivers, and then kind of thinking about this, you know, at all levels. What's the conversations that you have with mentors? What's the language that you use with mentors about parents and caregivers? And are you reinforcing a deficit perspective, or are you really trying to help cultivate that strengths perspective? So the staff who interact with the families and with the mentors just have a really critical role of changing the tone and changing the conversation, but they're likely going to need some support in doing that, and doing that to the best of their ability as well, and kind of rooting out some of these implicit negative biases that might be at play.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And next slide, Hank had some pointers though, and again, there's no way we can give you definitive answers today, but some starting point thoughts about things that you can, sort of some do's and don'ts that might get you to a more collaborative approach. Go ahead, Hank.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely speak to these real quickly, but I find it very compelling to make sure that we all also understand that a good homework assignment would be to understand the history of those students and families you're working with, and also to learn a lot about their ethnic dialect, and clearly to understand systemic institutional racism. I think that sets the tone for you then to be able to move forward in being better equipped to understand why this transformational conversation we're having is critical, and that we can't maintain the Reformation style of the past. So what are some suggestions? Let's not assume that the caregiver won't participate. And again, I believe that it's not so much about what you know, but that you care. And the more you care, people tend to look at you different and become more participatory, knowing that you care. And do schedule at a time that caregivers can meet, not what's best for you. Maybe it may be inconvenience for you initially, but I think that the value of meeting that time frame that fits the caregiver will give you a better outcome in terms of developing a relationship with the family. Do be proactive and positive. You know, don't just wait until there's a problem to reach out. I mean, be consistently involved in activities that are going on with that child that shows that you're not there just because there's something wrong. You're there because you're part of the family. Don't assume that just because they didn't show an interest that you're uninterested, or you don't have, that you're being irresponsible, that something's wrong with you, that you have to question yourself. Again, it's really about the kind of energy that you bring to that relationship in the beginning. Again, they can feel that you care. And when people, again, feel that, then they're open. And then also do advocate for caregivers and help them gain respect in their children's school and in their other systems. If you look back on the different systems that I talked about that are impediments that still exist for people of color, there's a lot of room for you to be involved. You could even go to a parent teacher conference and be there to support that parent. And I think if we haven't gotten there yet, I think it's really also really important that we understand how to differentiate between parent involvement and parent engagement. There's a major difference between the two. So if you think about parent involvement, it's actually giving a parent some activity that is being dictated. I'd like for you to start going to the PTA meetings. I'd like for you to be involved in the parent night, the raffle for the car, where we're going to talk about all the school activities. That's involvement. But what we really want to do is create parent engagement. And when you talk about engagement, you're talking about sitting down with that parent and developing a partnership that it's agreeable in terms of what the expectations are for both partners in relationship to the other partner, which is the student. That's parent engagement. You will be amazed at how parents respond when you sit down and you discuss with them, how can we work together? There's a famous question that we always ask every parent, and the answer has always been yes. The question is there any reason why you do not want your child to be the best he or she can be? And unequivocally, most parents, all parents, we've never had one answer different. They say yes. Yes, I want my child to be the best he and she can be. So how can we work together? This is your response. How can we work together to help your child be the best that he and she can be in partnership? And that's your opportunity then to begin to put together a unification of partnershiping with that parent to have that common goal that you just agreed on to see that child be the best he or she can be. That's a great way to segue into developing a partnership. And if you think about what was said, those are all caring feelings in words. I care. I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Oh, Hank, thank you so much. And that's a great note to pretty much end on. I want to put something out real quick as people are signing off. One thing I want to say before I say anything else, we actually would like to continue this conversation. I should have said this earlier, sorry. So please sign up in the chat if you'd like to be involved in some follow-up discussions on this. We know we just raised a lot of questions. There will be, the recording of this will be archived and the materials, but we'd like to continue the conversation with anyone interested. So please sign up in the chat if you'd like to be contacted about that, and we can go a lot deeper into this. And the presenter's information is here. If you want to reach out to any of us, please feel free. And so folks might have to jump off, please do so. But I do want to address some of the questions that came in were about working with systems-involved families. So Minnie, if you could go back a slide. I just want to say that, yes, it is more, it's less straightforward about how you engage caregivers when we're talking about systems-involved families. So I would say that that's a big topic. But first of all, understanding who the different sort of parental or caregiving figures are in a child's life, really letting the mentee kind of drive how they want those people involved in their life, but showing respect to all of them. And you actually have to work with the system. You actually have to figure out who is sort of the team that is working with that child, and how do you work in that system and in that setting. So I do a lot of work with youth and foster care and in justice systems, and there's a whole systems approach you have to take. There was also some questions about resources. California, we actually put together a list of resources on anti-racism and implicit bias and some of those things. So I'll be happy to share that out. And we have our blueprint in progress for racial justice that we put in the slide here. There have been a couple previous webinars on caregiver engagement and family engagement. That's on the next slide if you want to see some more depth on that. So there are lots of resources we can point you to, and we would love to continue this conversation with anybody who's willing and interested. We'll reach out to anybody who signs up. So with that, I just really want to thank Renee and Hank for bringing such an incredible discussion to the forefront. I hope that folks listening and watching were able to kind of take some of this history and sort of this compelling why and wherefore. And I know that it's just the beginning of a journey for a lot of us. So we hope that you'll embark upon that journey, and we're here to support as you do. And Minnie, thank you so much for supporting us administratively and riding the waves of some tech challenges. And just thanks everyone for showing up for something so important and being patient with difficult material. Really appreciate everyone, appreciate being in collaboration with everyone here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And then feel free to also just browse some of our additional resources we have on Mentor's websites, including the National Mentoring Resource Center. There's actually some stuff on there on family engagement. I know Renee is also part of our research board with the NMRC. Feel free to reach out to your mentor affiliate as well. And then please help us with your feedback on the survey after you exit. And please stay connected and join us next week. We actually have another webinar next Thursday on motivational interviewing. So we hope to see you there. And thank you all so much and take care.